To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people, and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7 so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big seller around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights at a gas station/liquor store when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online so that they wouldn't run my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working on overnights for a long time. Even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into the liquor store and gas station in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced on one night, before I started working there, that a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and then shove a gun up to her back, then demanding her for money. She complied with him, and luckily, he let her go. She ran into the store sobbing hysterically, and though the police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally preferred to having two people on with me, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The night seemed to go by so much quicker when someone else was there, and it was really nice that the person I normally close with got along with me so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and was really only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she would really only work about 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together about 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or I about 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't really particularly like the job or really want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't really complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a little bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with more than one person 1 day a week. Nobody seemed to really like him or like working with him. Nick was also a little off from the start. He was one of those people who basically told you his entire life story as soon as he met you, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one was really comfortable with hearing. One thing that he always seemed to talk about was the strain that was on his marriage. Apparently, he had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed, but he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to the people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't be violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a really bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself have always really struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I mean, I wouldn't be killing people by any means, but I'd probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories, so as creepy as that was, I just assured them that a lot of people need to take medicine for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick with it and you're honest with medical professionals, there's no reason you can't still do anything anyone else can do. He seemed really pleased with this answer, and soon after, the subject was then turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for about the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and he felt like things were really going well with them. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wished that he would just stop talking to me about it and would really just leave me alone. Josh had a wife and daughter who was about 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but to see us younger girls as kind of like his daughter and what she might have to deal with one day. He also seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was really grateful for, and he didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't too long before Nick had started conversations with me going into details about why I was diagnosed instead of how his medicine was working, which I won't get into because a lot of it was very violent and sexual. I told him repeatedly that I really didn't want to know about that, to which he would act like he understood and then change the subject, only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided in Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it. She later told her friend about it, which was the same manager who asked her to come work there. The manager said she couldn't really do much, since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working with him after he was talked to by the manager, and soon enough, about 2 other women who had worked with him on the night shift reported comments that he made to them to the manager. I was questioned, in which I agreed that all of the statements made by the women were pretty similar to the things that had been said to me. Nick was then given a final warning and a write-up. The next couple of times I saw him, he would go on these rants about how the people that were reporting him only did it because they didn't like him. I assumed that he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither I or Josh had any intention to tell him. He got so angry at one point that he was practically in tears, saying how those lucky whores were really lucky that he was on his meds and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about that point that his shift had ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh then told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we really didn't have time to chat with him. He nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had arrived extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that still needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do unless they absolutely had to was stocking the drink coolers. It was true that it was easier to do at night when there was a lot less customers, so it was pretty annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. I can't really remember the time that Josh had went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there for a while at that point. I was still pretty focused on stocking all of the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell had chimed, signaling that someone had come into the store. I threw out a good evening and said that I'd be right there, since anyone that usually came in that late usually just wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me but leaning over to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out he was drunk, but I wasn't able to detect it right away, as the smell of booze always seemed to linger in the air around there anyways. And Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I actually considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go or if I should run into the cooler and go get Josh. Nick wasn't a young fit guy or anything, but years of drugs and drinking had really aged him prematurely and totally ruined his body. But I mean, he was still pretty intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned right toward me, and that's when I noticed something immediately was off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me. There was nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he then spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring.
Did he leave you alone?
It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steady voice that Josh was in the cooler, and then I asked if he wanted me to go get him. And once again, he was just staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was really creeping me out. I then decided to ask with more force in my voice. "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he then grinned at me in a really disgusting, almost singing voice. Then he said,
"You're lying. I know you're alone."
He laughed and then he took a step toward me but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps backwards. At this point, I should have just run to Josh. I should have called for him, really anything, but I really couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. I mean, Nick was really weird, but I had never felt like I was in actual danger around him. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow stumbling steps, then saying,
"Come here. I just want to talk."
I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that was specifically amusing, and he laughed loudly enough that Josh had told me later was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks to see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second, and he seemed to come out of nowhere, then shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything. They just stared each other down before Josh then said in a really stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick just blankly stared for a moment, then scoffed, then telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there and had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against Nick. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corraling Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both of our parts, Nick then turned and then took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face, and Josh then grabbed the back of his coat and then brought him down as he then smashed his knee into Nick's stomach or chest area. I'm not really sure which, but he used the opportunity of his sputtering to drag him to the door and then throw him out, now locking it. Josh had just turned and he told me to call the cops as we then heard this sickening crack from behind him. We both jumped and looked at the door to then find this really big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie or one of an actual car wreck when something hits a windshield, but not hard enough to break through, and it turns white all around the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do. This time I ran to the register, grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the front door, and then huddled on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh had told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time that he noticed that Nick had a knife in his other hand. The fact that he tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was absolutely sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so loud. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background with loud smashes of Nick hitting the floor, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address because just as I got up to look at a receipt to what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that the officers were already on the way and to do whatever I could to get away or even hide, even if that meant that I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, but he made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and then throwing it at the part of the window that he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through though. From that hole, he could reach the lock on the door, then get back inside. According to Josh, he had walked up to the door and then he put his mouth against the hole that he had just formed, and then said something that even right now I still sob over, in that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time I talked to him that night. He then said in such a happy tone,
"They're never going to find you two."
Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was shitting bricks just as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole, and he wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh then slammed his entire body into it, knocking Nick backwards from the impact. Josh then yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors that were in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling for us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain, as he then realized that it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it again before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he had actually planned this all out to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me some time to slam the back room door shut and then lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut, when Nick then finally reached it. He must have heard me crying because he kept calling my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted, He would make sure that I died before I felt any kind of pain if I opened the door for him. He then started stabbing the door, then screaming at me to open it. I screamed and then I moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both then moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I just couldn't think of anything to say. I was just as terrified myself. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to go get it. So we really had no idea how long it would be until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't really last long against his body slams. And there was absolutely no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to die here tonight. That my dog would never know why I didn't come home. That I would never get my degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life. That all of the plans for the future that my girlfriend and I had made would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There was no police car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, then listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when we heard a gunshot then go off once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence, then at last a voice rang out, then asking if anyone was here. We weren't really sure if we should say anything. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed all of the things aside in front of the door, opening it enough just to put his head out of it, and then it seemed like all of the breath just totally left him. He opened the door and went out into the store. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer was, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but that they were all pretty far away and he had a really horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there because though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said that he would have run after him, but with the state that the store was in, he was really scared that someone in the store could be dying or hurt. The next 20 minutes were a total blur. Josh and I were just sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police finally arrived. The EMT had called dispatch and he told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were then diverted to looking for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got to go home and came in to see my dog's wiggling body as he was so excited to see me. Nick was found about 2 weeks later in an old RV that he had in the woods. The reason that he had come after us was because he thought that the reason Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had actually kicked him out about 4 days before this all happened, and she was actually in the process of getting a restraining order against him, due to a bunch of threatening texts and phone calls that she had been getting. Nick stated to the police that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target and he really didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called an owner or even a manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. It was really disturbing what he was saying in hindsight, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things that it didn't even register to us that he could be serious about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent toward anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check on them before they were hired. So I mean, it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. Nick took a plea deal. He did this so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and instead would go to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm writing this story now is that I got a phone call about 2 weeks ago. It was basically notifying me that as long as there's no setbacks to his health, Nick is actually set to be released on June 8th of this year. When I called Josh, he said that he had received the same news the day before. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city. I've switched to going to college completely online, and I'm in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I really don't think that he'll ever come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I read so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone always seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I really don't think that I'd be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had some pretty intense nightmares ever since that day, but ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I've ever heard it since it was actually said.
They're never going to find you two.
Nick, if it's really true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I never feel safe, especially at night. I'm honestly going to do my best to move on from this, but I just don't know how. Wish me luck.
Back when I was a senior in high school, I had a weekend job pumping gas at a highway gas station here in New Jersey. I saw all kinds of crazy stuff in the year or so that I worked there, but honestly, most of the stuff just came across as funny nowadays. Like even some of the closer calls with crazy customers or the time that I got robbed, I wasn't really in any life-threatening danger. I know how to handle myself, and I know not to do anything but cooperate with someone desperate enough to stick a gun in my face. We're trained to give up the money. It's insured, but there's no putting my brains back in my skull if I decide to be a hero over $50 in change. I mean, come on. The guy was even more scared than I was, so now it's ended up being like a crazy but not so scary story that I have no problem telling at parties or on dates or whatever. But then there's this one thing that happened that I don't bring up so easily, and that only ever comes out when people want to know what's the worst thing I saw. Sometimes I'm not even in the mood to talk about it, because I know that it can't have been just some rare one-time thing that only ever happened to me. But other times I feel like I gotta warn people, so they'll recognize it and act on it like I did. That's another part of this I hate. I feel like it sounds as if though I'm trying to make myself out as some hero in this situation, but I can promise you, I don't feel that way at all. I feel like I did the bare minimum, but enough intro, I'll get to the story. One night, I was working the night shift when an Audi with South Carolina license plates pulled in at around 2 in the morning. Some guy got out, asking me to fill up his car while he went to the bathroom. He put a $20 bill into my shirt pocket, promising another $20 if I could get the tank filled up quickly. Naturally, I rushed to do as he said, and I noticed a middle school-age girl asleep in the back seat, covered up to her chin with a blanket. I didn't want to wake her and risk losing my tip, so I proceeded to fill the tank as fast as I could while still being careful, keeping an eye on her to ensure that she wasn't waking up. She remained asleep, and as I focused more on filling the tank, I suddenly got this chill through myself when I looked back up at her. She was staring at me with her eyes wide open. Before I could say anything, she mouthed 2 clear words through the glass to me. "Help me." There was a moment where I just stopped dead, hand on the gas pump no longer filling up, and then I heard his voice asking, "Hey, everything all right over there?" I had to think on my feet pretty quick. I told him that something was wrong with the pump and that I could head back inside to reset it so the gas would start pumping again. I went on about how it had been happening on and off all day, apologized for the inconvenience, and assured him that it would be working in just a second. I ran inside, pushed the silent alarm, and then walked back out to finish filling up his tank. He fell for the whole thing, and if I say so myself, I put on an Emmy-winning performance and not completely freaking out and either strangling him or making some misguided attempt to actually rescue the girl. The cops later told me that I did the right thing. I had his plate number on the cameras, I got a good look at him and the girl, and his fingerprints were on the cash that he gave me. I made sure to call 911 as soon as they left, but thanks to the silent alarm, a patrol unit was already on the way to me. The dispatcher redirected the cop to the road the guy pulled off onto, and bingo, he was pulled over on a traffic stop. Supposedly all ended well for that particular girl, but how many others don't get a chance to signal for help like that? How many end up in the trunk instead of the back seat? How many don't get rescued? It's those kind of questions that I try not to think about, which is why I don't like telling this story too much. However, I feel it's important to share it sometimes as a warning. If this reaches as many people as possible, maybe it'll save me a whole lot of breath and a whole lot of sleepless nights.
For a little backstory, this all took place when COVID-19 had shut everything down in March 2020. I was sent home from my college and I had to deal with Zoom classes, and I also went back to work at the burger joint that I would work at whenever I was home on breaks. I won't say the name of the place, but it was always very busy, and during COVID it made us even busier due to us being a fast food place, so we never had to close down, but other places in the plaza did. We always had some really crazy and nasty people, but the pandemic just made everyone so much worse. At the time, we had this one regular that would come in who we thought had some mental problems multiple times a week. He would be really emotionless in his talking and just gave really blank dead stares towards everyone, and just stood there like a gargoyle, really intimidating and statuesque. He would ride his bike up to the walk-up area and look through the sliding windows until one of us got to taking his order. But he only really liked certain people to take his order and was also very cold towards us. He would order the same thing every time, but wants it fresh right out of the grease and handled by once again only certain people. And to make sure of it, he'll intensely stare at us through the pickup window. He would make the other customers outside so uncomfortable that they would walk away or they would just sit in their cars until he left. He used to only come in during the day shifts, but because days were much busier than the night shifts, and with all his demands that he would give us every time, my manager got fed up and told him to no longer come here during the day, thus now making him a night shift problem. During the week, I would work night shifts because of class, and I would usually be clocking out by 10 p.m. It was around 9:30 and I was closing my side down and starting to clean when he then rolled up on his bike. I happened to be one of the few people he let take his order, so as usual I took his order. He wants everything completely fresh, the standard list of demands. But one demand he gave was new. He always orders a side of fries with his meal, and sometimes to put the fries in the carton we either use a scooper or tongs. He asked us to use the scooper instead of the tongs because it'll give him more fries. Me just wanting him to leave and being close to leaving myself, I just went over and told the fry guy what he wanted. The fry guy just rolled his eyes, knowing how annoying this guy is, and dropped some new fries in the grease for him. The fry guy went on a break shortly after, and the night manager took over a station and waited for the fries to be ready. She didn't know it was this guy though, and she used the tongs to put the fries in the carton. She then hands me the order to pass out. The guy slides open the window, and he told me that she didn't do what he asked and that he wants more fries in his bag, since it looked like she didn't put enough in, which she put plenty in. He just didn't get his way. Once again, just wanting to leave after I'm done with him, I just oblige and go back. My coworker who I'm going to call Lee calls back and says that I shouldn't let him do that. I then called back saying that we've been letting him control us for months, and it's not my problem to handle a manager's problem if he has issues. My night manager hears this and sees it's the guy at the window. They then groan and they ask me what the issue is with him this time. I explained her the story and she went up to him and told him that it makes no difference what she does. He's getting his order fresh every single time by the people he wants to make his order, so to just suck it up and take the bag. She hands him the bag and then storms in the back to finish her inventory. The guy then pokes his arm and head in the window and tries to get one of the other coworkers to remake his order. Coworker and I both said that we're not going to do that since there was nothing even wrong with his food. Well, he doesn't like this, and he actually throws his bag of food inside the store and spills it all over the floor. E sees this and absolutely loses it. She runs over to the window that he's still in and then screams at him how he can't disrespect us like this, and that we for sure won't be remaking his order now, but we'll give him his money back. He then screams at her, and they actually go at it for a few minutes. I call up the night manager, and she runs up to also scream at him. As he gives the guy back his money, he actually grabs her arm and then yanks her almost through the window. Now, because of the pandemic, we have these plastic dividers at the top of where the customer would be speaking to. So if that wasn't there, she would have went straight through the window. Now everyone is screaming at this guy to get the hell out of there and that we're calling the cops as he just assaulted a minor. Earlier that week, E had racial slurs screamed at her by a bunch of rednecks because she was black. I felt really bad for her dealing with two big issues that happened in such a short period of time. She broke out of his grasp and ran to the back. The guy didn't even leave. In his crazy, twisted mind, he thought he was in the right here. He was running in circles outside of our walk-up area and was actually screaming to himself about E and how he's gonna set the cops on us. He tries banging on the windows to further get our attention, but we just ignored him. 4 cop cars drove in, blocking the entrance and the exit of the drive-thru so that no one can come in or leave. They talked to him and the guy just isn't grasping that he attacked a minor and he's crazy. The owner of the company sends in the security footage of just what happened to the cops, and we set the guy on trespassing. The guy actually had to be escorted off the property because he wouldn't leave. He thankfully hasn't come in since that day, but we still see him riding around the road next to our place, and he gives us menacing looks every time he passes by, not once breaking eye contact. He really wasn't right in the head. The dead stares he would give us through the windows, the emotionless way he would speak to us, how picky he was with everything, and how quick he snapped and resorted to violence. It was insane. Very fortunately, E didn't get any injuries from the incident and was only shaken up, but she did quit a few weeks later, and I can't really blame her. I feel really bad for her. No one should ever have to deal with being assaulted by customers or having racial slurs spewed at them. She was way too young to have to deal with that.